Thanks for having me, and thanks for everybody for joining. I appreciate it. This is definitely one of my favorite topics to talk about in data in general is data modeling. So who am I? My name is Keith Belanger, and I am the SqlDBM product evangelist. I have been in data management for about 27 years, and in that time frame, I've had just about every role you could have, from data strategy, modeling, architecture, data engineering, DBA, BI development, and obviously cloud modernization, both on the OLTP and OLAP space, though I would say 80% of my time has mostly been on the analytics space. I'm a recognized Snowflake Data Superhero. Um, Kimball, so I spent most of my time really doing Kimball, and over the last few years, a Data Vault practitioner. So a little bit about myself. So this seems to have been a very big question that comes up these days. It's the big elephant in the room. You know, do we still need data modeling? I hear this question quite a bit. And being, the person that I am and the experience that I have, it's like, how could you be asking me this question? Of course we do, right? So do we still need data modeling? And to simply put, yes, yes, and yes, right? I can't express more. And oftentimes the reason being this comes up is because this is seen by many as strictly as a technical exercise. However, data modeling should be more than just building database objects. And kind of elaborate on this, I'm going to kind of go probably back to when NoSQL started coming out and we started moving away from just relational databases and over to NoSQL, and organizations and developers seeing that I can just create, a file with the structure that I want, and start moving away from modeling or creating the database objects and tables, and it starts being seen as it was a problem. So that's kind of from when I started seeing data modeling start to dwindle from what people perceive data modeling to be just about, and into where we are today. But when I started, I started doing data modeling. It was in 1995. And you did everything starting with the data model. It was one of the very first things that you learned to do, or that you did. I was doing data modeling far before I learned how to write SQL. And that just became a skill set that I added later on. So the biggest thing for me is modeling describes the business story. It describes reality, right? That's what you're ultimately trying to do, is present what is the business that I am working with, or I am at, and in a information perspective, in terms of what type of data and information does that organization need, and how does it relate to each other. So what I have seen over the years without modeling being involved, right, I've seen an uptick in data quality issues, data redundancies, performance, and increased costs, right? We kind of, especially now with cloud, we can make up for redundant data or bad relationships with just giving it a little bit more juice and compute, without having an understanding of data relationships, who's parent, who's child, referential integrity, and other things like that. You can start having data quality issues. You can start having redundant data. So I personally feel the master data management field has made a very good living on poor upstream data modeling and data practices, because we got to clean everything downstream. To me, this then leads to an ever-ending cycle of tactical solutioning, right? We're always like, how do we fix that? Let's fix that. Let's fix that. And so we start solving some of these problems tactically, because we did things in a very microscopic perspective. So yeah, one particular developer doing something can maybe add something to a NoSQL file or to a structure to meet the requirements of their needs, but how does that fit into the big picture? And then you start seeing a loss of business losing trust in the data, right? If the data isn't speaking to them, then they're going to lose trust, and you're going to start seeing them go not using the data or going in other directions. And you start seeing highly skilled data practitioners spend a lot of time bridging the gap. And so, as an example, they say that the average data scientist spends 80% of their time wrangling data. I just think that's a very expensive resource to be using wrangling data versus building insight. And I personally feel a lot of that can be managed and decreased if you're doing proper data modeling. Um, and especially as we get into the world of AI, everybody's the talk of the town right now, right? Of doing generative AI and getting insight. Well, your AI is going to be only as good as the data that you're training it with and what you have for structures beneath it. And if you want to spend more time training, you're going to have to be spending more time, cleaning up and fixing that data. And so from my perspective, there is that relationship between having good data modeling and what you're going to be able to get out of your AI. So what have I heard over the years? Well, I've heard we don't have the time. We're agile, right? I don't know how many of you have heard that or maybe even using that as your reason why not to do data modeling. And I'll be the first to admit that if you're trying to do data modeling processes and methods that you did 20 years ago, you will become a bottleneck, right? So we are becoming an agile um, organization. I mean, kind of culture, right? We are becoming more and more organizations are moving towards decentralized teams. So that means the data modeling space has to evolve with that, right? So if you're going to sit there and say, well, everybody has to come through me and we're going to do this big long process of modeling, then people will not have the time to do it. So you have to, you know, embrace where we are with time tested, data modeling practices. So I've been in data for like 27 years now, and I will say the data modeling techniques I learned 27 years ago still hold true today. What has changed is the technologies and the methodologies and the way we deliver. I mean, when I was first doing this, we were lucky if we did one change a month and we reloaded data once a month. Now, if you're not doing things, within minutes, sometimes seconds, and ultimately a lot, then you won't succeed. So modeling has to also embrace where we are with the times. So what does modeling do? Well, it gives us, we need to start with a plan. So oftentimes, and I've got these pictures, right? If I see similar things in data, if somebody is just building something without a plan, well, things might not make sense. They might not come together properly, right? You might have a balcony without an entryway or stairs going to no door, bridges don't align, right? We see these things, in our day to day in terms of people building something from a very, very micro perspective and not really understanding the macro, right? So I don't know how many people in there day to day from a data perspective is you will get individual developers or squads and teams who are building things without understanding what other teams and other squads are doing. And then, you get things that don't come together. So what does that look like? If you don't have an enterprise, perspective, you have your enterprise data puzzle, though we're moving towards more organizations being decentralized. Um, you still need to have that perspective, right? You still need to understand where is the business need, and then how are all the pieces of these puzzles going to come together. These different domains, these different, as we talk about data mesh and area, they could be different technologies, right? They could be different ways of managing the data, but at the end, right, it all has to come together, right? And the reason being is that from my perspective, data modeling is and always will be about the business. And we can tend to forget that over time, right? Is that we can in IT get caught up in um, my job is I can get clever, I can get innovative, I can, do these great things with my application, but how does what I'm doing fit into the big picture of the business, right? So that's one thing I always try to remind people is that, we like to play with technology, we like to do things, but what we're ultimately trying to do, right, is we're trying to support our business so that they can meet their objectives. And I call it, we got to be going at the speed of business. So how do we understand the business? What does that mean, the business? And you'll hear in many folks, and they'll talk about, if some of you are familiar with doing data vault, there's a lot of talk about ontologies and taxonomies. And I think that holds true regardless if you're doing data vault or if you're doing Kimball, or others. You just need to make sure you're understanding what the business is. So what do we mean by ontologies and taxonomies? And let's simplify it a bit, right? So what the heck is an ontology? So an ontology is a set of concepts and categories in a subject area or domain that shows their properties and relations between them. That's just like kind of like the definition. you know so for me, it's like, okay, let's going to go with, and it's an enterprise conceptual model that has entities made up of business concepts and has the relationships between them in an ER diagram, right? So what we're trying to identify here are business concepts. Understanding what those business concepts are that the business communicates with, how they talk, what terms do they use, um, versus what does a technical solution have for names of structures and so forth, right? So to me, it's what are those business concepts that we need to extract and understand from the business. And then what the heck is a taxonomy, right? So it's a hierarchical structure preparing data into specific classes of data based on common characteristics. Okay, let's just go with subtypes underneath those business concepts, right? So here what we're trying to understand is what are those business concepts, the language in which the business speaks, right? And the terms that they use. Um, in in doing this, you're going to find within organizations is, do they even use the same terms in business concepts between one area of the business and others? Then this last statement, I'm going to kind of, I'll see it again probably in another slide, but is when you're doing this exercise and understanding the business, you need to not discuss your business application systems. And I've seen this a lot, is we can get highly influenced by the technologies and the systems that are in place. So if you're using an SAP, or if you're doing a Salesforce, or you're doing any other ERP solution or a COTS product that has, more often than not, those data structures and those solutions are structured in a way to be generic, to be multi-organization fitting, right? And you configure them. So if you try to think about your warehouse and where you're going and driving it based off of these source applications, then you're going to miss, from my perspective, you're going to miss it, right? You're not going to hit what the business needs are. You need to understand the business and how they speak. So how do we do this? So one, data modelers and architects, yes, you must engage and associate with the business. And it sounds like that's common sense, but you'd be surprised at how many architects and modelers sit in the IT world and don't engage with the right business people. And when I say the right business people, it's a cross section of business people, right? You need to be speaking with people at the C-suite level. You need to be speaking with people even at the lower levels and middle levels as well. You got to get that cross section and understanding of the business and the terms and the business concepts that they speak. So don't be afraid to ask dumb questions. So I over the years I've done what I call stump the chump sessions, me being the chump. Ultimately what you're trying to do is engage with these with people, and to engage with these people, people love to critique. I don't know how many people have seen that or have experienced that. Probably all have. But if you give something, if I was to put a blank, sit in front of a blank whiteboard and say, what are your business concepts, right? We would probably hear crickets. You need to have a conversation with people. And oftentimes the conversations will start if people see something is wrong. So I might say, yeah, you guys have customers, or you have, we don't have customers, we have clients. Okay, great, you have clients. What types of clients do you have? Right, it starts the conversation. So to me, you can't ask questions, or you can't say, tell me what your business concepts are. right? You have to sit there and engage in a conversation. Tell me about your business. You're in marketing. Like, what do you have? How do you do marketing? Do you have like any type of campaigns? People love to talk, and engaging in that conversation, and then taking what you might hear from one individual area, and now I'm going to share that with another area of my business and see if they agree with that, right? Do they use the same type of business concepts? Do they have the same types of, and now you might say, no, we don't call it, a client, we call it a customer. So I got one calling a customer, one calling a client. And then when you talk about customer and you say, well, you're all on the same page as a customer, like, well, we consider the customer the person who pays the bill. Well, we consider the customer the person that's on the contract. Okay, they could be different. So it's bringing out those types of conversations. Those start becoming your real business concepts, and then understanding the relationships between them. And like I said, I find holding these interactive conversations now, I mean, it used to be we would sit in a room with a whiteboard. Nowadays it could be a virtual whiteboard, but it's really mixing and matching people to then really lay that out. Again, do not boil the ocean. And what do I mean by that? So we talked earlier on about I don't have time, right? It's a very fine balance in terms of if I'm going to go into an enterprise and understand that model across, working again from the top down, is I'm not going to fully dive into all of the gory details. I'm going to get enough to understand that area. And then again, if we're agile and we're doing certain things in the organization, we can dive into those areas later on, right? Project 1, project 2, project 3. But let's get at the high level. You can probably do a good enterprise high level model across an organization in a couple of weeks, depending on people's availables and so forth. But it shouldn't take that long. And then depending on your initiatives and your projects, you can then dive down into the detail. Let patterns be your guide. So if you guys aren't familiar with David Hay, Lynn Silverstone, John Giles, I would highly recommend, and I'll show you some of their material at the end, taking a look at their stuff. Every organization, no matter what, within their data, we all use similar patterns. And some of these you might have heard of. We have party patterns, and we have agreement patterns, and product patterns. And I'm not saying that you take these patterns and you take them out of the book and that's your structure. No, you use them to drive the conversations and understand, well, what parties are, and I'll use this in my head, well, what parties are in this organization, right? Well, we have employees, we have customers, we have, maybe partners, and suppliers, and you use these patterns to, from my perspective, to accelerate where you're trying to go to. And leveraging these patterns, and these folks have over the years have really refined these patterns because they can fit in just about every vertical. You just need to take them and adapt them to your organization. Again, in these sessions, do not discuss your business application systems. It is a very hard thing because I've been in conversations and you start getting into a certain topic and then they'll say, but in SAP XYZ or in our Salesforce, it's like, cut it off. What I want to understand is how the business sees data within their organization. Right. And we'll get you down the road, and we're not going to get to it here, but down the road is like, as you're going from that top down, you start working from your bottom up, and you have to bring those two worlds together. How do I take my top down model is really the focus of what we're trying to do now is I want to understand the business in this perspective right now. So with that, I'm going to kind of do a demonstration of this to kind of give and I have a fictitious business here called it SQL Perk for coffee geeks and data freaks. So, and again, remember at this phase, we are modeling a business and not a system, right? So again, we're not trying to sit here and say, oh, I'm going to need this type of tables and this, that, and this. We're really trying to understand is model the business. So at the moment, I'm going to just get out of this. Hopefully this will work. Do you guys now see SqlDBM? Yes. Yep. Okay. So here is an example of how I've done an ontology and taxonomy, right, I'm going to start with the patterns, right? So again, I've kind of thrown some here, party resources. So if I start with party, and I can start saying, well, what do you have in your organization as parties? Well, we have employees and customers. So I'm going to play a little scenario here. I say we have customers, and somebody else is going to say, no, 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 we don't have customers. We have brew brew brewstomers, right? Whatever that might be. So if I was to sit there and say, okay, we call them, I'm doing this on purpose. It sounds silly, but the what I'm trying to drive is you're trying to get the language the business speaks. This company, this organization, what do they speak, right? So we have employees, but employees, we have general managers, we have baristas, we have other things, right? From our organizations, we have accounting, we have marketing, we have vendors, right? You're trying to drive this level of detail, right? If you start looking at this, those of you who might be doing like star schemas, or if you're doing Data Vault, you might start sitting there saying, hey, look, there's a hub, Brewster hub, right? Or we're going to have a dimension of an employee, right? Is what this is starting to drive is that, again, that ontology and taxonomy of that organization in the language they speak, right? Barista, general manager, right? If we just call something like party, that means nothing to the business, right? But these terms start. And then it's the same thing with resources. So if I'm my coffee shop, what do I have for resources? Well, I have provisions, I have real estate, I have equipment, right? For equipment, I have refrigerators, I have espresso machines. For real estate, I have a warehouse and I have stores. I have pastries and dairy and coffee beans, right? All of this as the model, this is telling me a story. This is telling me the story about the business and the terminology they use. And when we start getting to a point in our life cycle, now when I got to go and get my source data, you know, the structures that you're going to get the data from to populate this are probably not going to be a table called, um, espresso machine, right? Or it might be something else like, but this is starting to get the picture of how the business needs to, is going to interact and relate to that data and what they're going to expect to see. And again, nothing here is showing any type of database design. Nothing here is showing like this is going to be, this type of table in Snowflake or this type of table in a Databricks. It's purely a representation of the business and the concepts and the relationships between them, right? Same thing here if I go into like products. So yeah, we have beverages, we have gift cards, we have bakery, we have bagel, bread, muffins. Again, I'm not giving all of the information. I'm getting enough to tell the story, or to the same thing. You might get another group to say, no, we do this, right? And the benefit of doing this type of design is that I can hold this in front of a business person, a non-technical person, and they can comprehend this. They can critique it. And on top of that, this should hold true whether you're like, I've done this on top of this type of database, and a couple of years from now, I've done this on this type of database, or it's a NoSQL database, or I'm doing, kind of like messaging architecture, or if I'm doing an API services. It doesn't matter, right? This is how the business sees their data. And then you start putting those pieces together inside your kind of an enterprise model, right? So I have, a brewster places an order, the barista enters that order. That order has items that are product, and somebody said, no, 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 we don't have products. We call them menu items. Okay, let's rename this, right, to menu item. Right? Okay, we've captured that. And then we have recipes for those menu items, and they use equipment and provisions to make those, right? And they come from a vendor. So here we're kind of building out that conceptual model in the terms, in the way that that business and organization speaks. And the great part is I start looking at this thing. If you're doing Data Vault, you start seeing your hubs. If you're doing just Kimball, you start seeing your dimensions. Oh, I'm going to need an equipment dimension and a provisions dimension, and maybe I'm going to need a store dimension, right? A barista. You start seeing that picture, and then now as you start building down going from that top and going down, technically, when they go into their data solutions to get that data, this is now the language they're looking to see. And having this plan ahead of time. Now, if you're doing, say you're doing a data mesh and you have decentralized teams and you have your bounded context in terms of these people are doing this domain of data, even from that decentralized perspective, this is the enterprise perspective. You might have a squad of people who are really focusing on, a certain, like, just order. Now, behind this order conceptual model, there could be many tables that make up orders, right? And many different aspects of data that you would eventually, when we say drive down into that detail as you get lower. But the team who's managing, or the area of the business that might be managing the order products, could be different than the team of people that are working on, say, the recipe that puts the coffee together. But in the end, we can see here how these pieces need to interact with another. And as we start going towards that, towards whether we're doing a star schema or we're doing a data vault perspective, that this is ultimately the vision that we're trying to get together. So again, this is just using a modeling tool. Again, this is very conceptual in terms of how do these business concepts relate to one another, and being able to then take this in towards our, again, if you're doing Data Vault, or if you're doing Kimball, or however you're doing it, this ultimately is the goal to meet your business's expectation in terms of getting to understand what data is available for us to use. So that's kind of what I have from the demonstration of the tool part of this. But again, just showing how the tool can be leveraged, not just to create tables, right, in DDL to your databases, but doing that top-down modeling. And for the most part, in organizations I've worked with, this part of the exercise does not get done, right? There's no, if I would say, show me your enterprise model, your high-level enterprise model. Oftentimes they don't. They'll show me their physical dimensional model, or their physical raw vault model. But if you were to ask, well, where was that driven from? How did you come to that? Or do you just go and start building parts and pieces? So I'm going to quickly go back to my slide deck here. So again, that was my fictitious company, but whatever company you're at, definitely, take as an exercise. And what I do, even when I started here as SqlDBM, I started creating a ontology of the organization, because one is, it helps me understand the story and helps me understand the business in the terms they speak, and I'll review it with folks, and no, that's not what we call it, or even it'll expose that we have different terms for the same thing, right? Many organizations will have, we'll use channel, and then that term channel is different in the different areas of the business. So let's kind of recap. What business value does the business model bring, right? So it identifies the key terms for your business glossary, right? So you're going to start seeing, based on what we had, these are the key terms that the business interacts with, they leverage, and you would probably want to start populating your business glossary to define those terms. And you'll probably start getting some level of definition and understanding of those terms while you're doing those sessions. Like when I was doing my Stump the Chump sessions, you start gathering, okay, you guys are both calling something the same thing, but you have two different definitions, right? So how can we clean up? Do we clean up one of the names or something like that? And while we're doing that, let's capture some of those definitions. Strategic planning, data modernization, application development. Again, many organizations right now are going through large data modernization efforts, right? Well, if you're going to be migrating, say, from an on-prem legacy type of data platform, and you're going to leverage, Snowflake or Google BigQuery or Databricks, well, during that modernization, now you can start seeing, well, let's start getting our data structures and let's start getting our data products to be within this business concept, these business concepts, right? When you're doing application development. So again, I've been talking a lot about warehousing, but even in application development, if people are building those applications and you're saying here that this can have one or many this, does the application being developed support that? Just to kind of give a little example of that I've seen, and this was a few years back, right? It's like, oh yeah, the customer can have an email, and it went with that, but it was never asked, well, can a customer have more than one email? Can an email belong to more than one customer? Can um, that customer's email change over time, right? Having those discussions went from that email address is just one attribute in the customer table, and then at that particular scenario, when the customer had a second email, they entered in a second customer, right? Versus having an email that can have a one to many. So driving those conversations, right? Again, having those right answers. If I'm an application development and I have this enterprise model to reference, that should tell me the story of where my business is going. Master and reference data management. Again, we kind of talked about it earlier, right? This can be very beneficial towards that master and reference data management. So I get them, hey, we have Brewstomers, right? We get to master those. We have employees, we have reference data. What are the valid values that we want for having our ingredients or things like that, right? So again, using these in those efforts, this same model could be sitting at the, like I said, at the enterprise perspective and being used for various different things going on within an organization. Identify candidate IT package solution. So again, is Salesforce the right fit for you? Because am I going to be able to get in there? So again, we didn't talk about solutions when we were doing the enterprise model, but now as we want to start getting solutions or build solutions, do those solutions fit for my enterprise model, right? Oh, I need to be able to have one or many of these, but that tool doesn't allow for that. Facilitate communication, common business vernacular, right? Again, I talked about it earlier, is we too often there is not enough communication between, say, IT and the business, right? Or even across the business. This is the opportunity to drive that, to make sure, hey, if we have a term or if we have a business concept, is it seen the same? Again, I'll use customer, right? Different areas of your organization might have a different definition for customer. If you're at a insurance company, the claims area probably sees the claimant as the customer. The billing department sees the payer as the customer. The on the policy side, you're going to have they're going to think that the people on the policy contract are the customer again. So it doesn't sound like we have customer as a business concept. We have claimant, we have payer, and we have insured, right? So again, having that common business vernacular that everybody can understand and agree, versus just saying everybody using the word customer thinking different things. It's used to shape the enterprise data warehouse design. Like, I think I've said this a few times, right? Data Vault, if you're doing your raw vault or you're doing your Kimball star schema, you should be, those dimensions, those hubs, those all should start to kind of reference and map back to those business concepts that we talked about, right? I want to slice my sales data by Brewstomer. I want to slice that data by menu items, right? I don't want to go in there and see party dimension and see, just product, right? That doesn't speak to the business, right? And that's the thing, what we're trying to make sure that we're doing is that our enterprise data warehouse design is built off and derived from that top-down enterprise design. And in closing, I'm actually going to this is Serge, who worked also at SqlDBM, who wrote a book, and this was kind of taken out of his book. Before defining data structures, we need to understand the business model that generates them. Such a model will make it possible to build the database system aligned to the business processes and able to anticipate change, like seeing a forest for the trees. Ubiquitous modeling allows us to see the business for the data. And I think that's just really nicely sums up what we're talking about. And I said, we're doing this for the business, and we need to make sure that we're delivering and meeting what they're expecting. So, that was me speaking for 40 minutes. And in reality, this is nothing that I invented. There's plenty of material, and these are some of my favorites. So there's The Nimble Elephant from John Giles. His other book which is The Elephant in the Fridge. The Data Model Resource Book by Lynn Silverstone, Paul Agnew, some great stuff on patterns. And then, as I said, Serge, who also works here at SqlDBM, has data modeling for Snowflake. Even though it says data modeling with Snowflake, there's a lot of great content that is kind of technology agnostic and just on terms of data modeling concepts. And if you haven't seen these books, they're great reference. I use them all the time, and check them out.